During World War II, the Nazis carried out one of the greatest cultural plunders in history. Masterpieces by artists such as Da Vinci, Vermeer and Klimt, ancient sculptures, unique manuscripts and even gold from central banks were systematically stolen across Europe. These treasures, many still missing, represented not only material wealth but the very soul of the occupied nations. In this brief history, we'll discover which were the most shocking and what fate befell them. The largest wine robbery in history. When Allied troops captured the Kehlstein House, the Eagle's Nest, and the surrounding area in Berchtesgaden in May 1945, they found not only looted documents and works of art, but something completely unexpected: a massive underground cellar filled with exceptional wines, Hermann's personal property. Göring. What began as a formidable haul grew into a fascinating story that encompassed soldiers paying homage, Soviet accountants sorting barrels, and modern collectors enjoying the last sip of a past tainted by violence. The original collection numbered around 3,000 bottles, including top-notch rarities. There are reports of the presence of kosher wines from Jerusalem from 1902, produced for Passover and laden with religious symbolism. There were also select examples such as Chateau Mouton Rothschild 1936 and fine German Moselle wines from the 1935 vintage. That such a refined collection included Jewish wine, while Jewish producers and merchants were being persecuted and dispossessed, lends the story with a macabre irony and totalitarian hypocrisy. In the early hours of May 4, 1945, soldiers from the US 101st Airborne occupied the Eagle's Nest and discovered 6 trucks loaded with bottles in pristine condition. The process was almost ceremonial. Some members of the military unit improvised tastings, toasting with champagnes and fine reds, while lending the victory an almost ritualistic dimension. However, the fate of many bottles remained shrouded in mystery. Both the US and USSR fought over the loot. While the Americans evacuated part of it to warehouses in Germany and Austria, the Soviets took bottles to Moscow and other regions such as Craiova, Moldova, and Crimea. In Craiova, the underground cellars became the last refuge for Göring's wine. Of the original 3 of the 1,000 bottles, only 130 were officially counted in the Moldovan Soviet collective archives. Among them, the unique and singular 1902 Jerusalem vintage stands out, along with 1935 Mosel wines, both carefully preserved. The current value of these bottles is impressive. It is estimated that they could reach €20 million, £0 to £25,000 per unit at auction, although some media even speak of $1 million offered for the bottle of Jerusalem. Even so, winery officials determined that these pieces are not for sale, being considered Moldovan historical heritage. The story takes on almost cinematic overtones. Remnants of Jewish wine served in amphibious Mercedes, improvised celebrations on the mountain, the clash of diplomatic expectations between allies. Years later, Craiova inaugurated a commemorative wing known as the Göring Collection, visited by tourists, journalists and collectors alongside other exceptional relics such as the staircase of Soviet sponge cannons and remains of a 19th century wine press. The symbol is potent: a wine glass, a liquid jewel, turned into a tourist attraction, while Göring tried to turn it into a trophy of racial supremacy. Ethical debates have arisen. Should these bottles remain in storage forever or renounce their symbolic value? Do the Jewish or German communities have the right to contest their restitution? Craiova, in guided tours, uses a respectful but seductive tone. They are preserved unopened at a stable temperature, 12 degrees Celsius, controlled lighting, and historical references that include one of the Easter glasses of 1902, a silent testimony to the contrast between glory and crime. According to accounts, an elderly diplomat remarked, "These bottles outlived their owners." Beneath this, the story is a mixture of arbitrariness and geopolitics. Wine, an ephemeral liquid of the festival, became a political relic. Moscow retained part of it until a musealization strategy was developed, while Colombia, Switzerland, and the US considered buying or sharing them for cultural purposes. But most of the 3,000 original bottles were lost. Liquor consumed in victory celebrations, given to diplomats, or spilled in improvised rituals. Some even disappeared from official lists. In his wine cellar in Craiova, now called the Göring Room, part of the collection remains intact alongside wines from Roosevelt and Eisenhower, demonstrating that a historical totality can be drunk from a single glass: luxury, expropriation, ideology, war, and memory. This symbolic capacity was noted in 2019 by Balkan Insight, which recounted how the 1902 Jerusalem bottle became the most historic of all, evoking a cultural holocaust not only of bodies but of traditions. The context is broader. The Jewish wine abandoned by Göring, looted, recovered, and preserved, serves today as a historical catharsis, a reminder of the odyssey that some cultural values suffered under Nazism: Jewish gold teeth and the concentration camp bank. The plundering of dental gold and jewelry in the Nazi camps was an essential and often silenced part of the Reich's criminal economy. On September 23, 1940, Heinrich Himmler signed the first order requiring the extraction of all gold teeth and crowns of deceased prisoners. On December 23, 1942, he issued another circular requiring systematic and monthly collection in the large camps from Auschwitz to Mauthausen. SS dentists, including Martin Hellinger, instructed medical commissions and prisoner dentists to use pliers immediately after executions, or, in the case of very weakened inmates, before they reached the gas chamber. The batches were packaged with labels from the WVHA, the Central Economic Office, and sent to Berlin, where they were melted down into ingots for the Reichsbank. The decree itself prohibited the return of a single piece to the families. Any request had to be answered that the body had been cremated, thus justifying the absence of dental remains. The refined gold was mixed with jewelry, rings, watches, necklaces, confiscated on the ramps of the extermination centers. Upon arrival of each shipment, the Sonderkommando from the Canada warehouses sorted suitcases, clothing seams, and pockets. The valuables were separated into numbered sacks and followed the same route as the dental metal. Internal Reichsbank documentation, now preserved in British and Swiss archives, reveals that gold from lenses, jewelry, and teeth was deposited by the SS on at least 76 occasions between 1942 and 1944, before being reminted with a Swiss stamp to conceal its origin. The plunder served a dual function: to finance strategic imports, chromium, tungsten, magnesium, and to sustain the Reich's image of solvency in neutral markets. Within the camps, the extraction of dental gold became routine. At Buchenwald, after the liberation, the Americans found wooden boxes containing hundreds of numbered dentures and crowns. At Majdanek, more than 18 kilograms of burnt amalgam fillings were recovered from the ashes of the crematoria. The procedure was strictly bureaucratic. Each SS dentist kept a notebook in which he recorded the grams removed and the date of melting. The resulting ingots were sent in sealed pouches to the headquarters of the Sanitätsinspektion der Waffen-SS in Berlin, Knissebeckstrasse. The confiscation of jewelry followed a similar path. At least 8.3 tons of precious metals, gold, platinum, and silver from personal belongings arrived at the Reichsbank by the spring of 1945. Much of it was hidden in the Merkers salt mines, where an American patrol found it on April 6, 1945. 8,307 gold ingots and sacks containing 189,000 marks worth of jewelry, wedding rings, and watches engraved with Jewish initials. Photographs taken that day would be used as evidence a few months later in Nuremberg, when prosecutors showed charred dentures and children's earrings to demonstrate the industrialization of theft. The machinery included Swiss banks. An internal report by the vice president of the Swiss Kreditanstalt suggested transforming unsolicited dental gold into Swiss ingots valid worldwide. Between 1942 and 1944, the gold sent by the Reichsbank was melted down and stamped with the Swiss banking trademarks, thus reintroducing it into international trade. The Allied Tripartite Committee estimated in 1946 that 15% of all recovered Nazi gold had clearly identifiable origins as dental gold or deportee jewelry. After the war, restitution was piecemeal and slow. Since 2015, the Polish Personal Imperial's Archives program has returned hundreds of wedding rings and necklaces to descendants of women deported to Ravensbrück and Neuengamme. One of the most recent cases, in March 2025, involved the delivery of a brooch and a medallion engraved with the Star of David to the Wasilewski family in Warsaw. However, Polish authorities estimate that only 2% of the jewelry confiscated on their territory has been traced. Sweden and Switzerland, under international pressure, opened commissions of inquiry in the 1990s that confirmed deposits of gold of undocumented origin equivalent to tens of millions of dollars. The dental gold trail also fueled legal proceedings. Between 1946 and 1948, 48 dentists were tried in various medical trials, 22 had served directly in concentration camps, and 19 were members of the Waffen-SS. Sentences ranged from death to symbolic sentences of a few months. Even so, the trial established professional responsibility in the chain of looting and left documents detailing the weekly number of crowns removed at Dachau and Sachsenhausen. In economic terms, dental gold and jewelry provided the Reich with a modest income compared to that from the looted central banks. But their symbolic value was immense. They turned the bodies and memories of the victims into metallic fuel for the war. Historians such as Xavier Riaud estimate that between 1942 and 1944 alone, between 25 and 30 tons of gold from teeth were melted down, equivalent to about $120 million at the time. Some of this metal ended up as payments to Swedish steel suppliers or for the purchase of Spanish tungsten. Another fraction ended up in Swiss, French, or West German vaults, reminted and ready for circulation without a trace of its origin. But if the dental gold already had an obscure value, the seized jewelry carried with it an added layer of sentimental cruelty. Every ring drilled to extract the stone, every strapless watch stored in numbered tins spoke of a truncated private history. At Auschwitz-Birkenau, after the liberation, the Soviets found 7 warehouses filled with 110,000 watches and 14,000 wedding rings piled in jute bags. Most of them had been melted down by the Soviet state to cover war expenses. Only a handful of pieces remained as evidence, now displayed behind glass cases in Block 5 of the Auschwitz Museum, alongside mounds of hair and eyeglass frames. An Austrian painter fascinated by the art of others. The Third Reich not only sought to conquer territories, but also to appropriate the cultural soul of Europe. From the early years of the Nazi regime, the systematic plundering of artistic and symbolic heritage was as deliberate as its military expansion. For Hitler, a frustrated Viennese painter and his leaders, art was not merely an aesthetic manifestation. It was a vehicle of power, an ideological weapon, a key element in the construction of a new civilization. War for them was not fought solely on the battlefields. It was also fought in museums, libraries, and the homes of Jewish collectors and gallery owners. It was a war against memory, against the visual testimony of European diversity. Unlike other authoritarian regimes, the Nazis were not content with destroying what they repudiated. Their vision was more ambitious: to appropriate, redefine, and reorder the artistic legacy under a new racial and national canon. Degenerate art, as they called expressionism, cubism, surrealism, or any work produced by Jews or non-Aryans, was to be eradicated or relegated to marginal collections, while classical, Renaissance, or Baroque works were to be elevated as symbols of Germanic cultural superiority. Following this logic, millions of pieces were stolen from their rightful owners, often after deportation, extortion, or murder. The beginning of this policy was not improvised. Already in 1933, with Hitler's rise to power, the purge of the German art world began, expelling Jewish artists, professors, critics, and collectors from all cultural institutions. The creation of the Reichskulturkammer, Reich Chamber of Culture, in October of that year marked the beginning of an administrative apparatus dedicated to controlling and filtering every cultural manifestation. But the real plundering began on a large scale after the Anschluss of Austria in 1938, when the Nazis were able to operate freely in Vienna, one of the artistic capitals of Europe. Some of the most cultured and wealthy Jewish families on the continent lived there, such as the Rothschilds, the Bloch-Bauers, and the Lederers, owners of collections that rivaled those of public museums. The case of Austria marked a turning point in the Nazi looting methodology. Until then, forced exiles and economic pressure on Jewish families had led to the desperate sale of works of art at ridiculously low prices, often under threat or with the illusion that these funds would allow them to flee the country. But in Vienna in 1938, confiscation became a state policy, systematic, meticulous, executed with bureaucracy and precision. The SS, together with officials from the Reich Ministry of Culture, began searching properties, inventorying assets, and dispatching expert agents to select the most valuable pieces. Families like the Rothschilds, whose collections included paintings by Rubens, Titian, and Van Dyck, as well as archaeological artifacts, clocks, tapestries, and jewelry from centuries past, were stripped of everything. Their case was so scandalous that even Nazi records detailed the volume of the loot with exorbitant figures. The Bloch-Bauer family, meanwhile, was stripped of one of the most iconic works of modern art, Gustav Klimt's portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer-Böhmen, known today as the Austrian Mona Lisa. This painting was taken over by the Belvedere Gallery in Vienna and renamed, eliminating all traces of its Jewish origin. It would not be returned until the 21st century, after a long legal battle led by Maria Altmann, the Bloch-Bauer's niece. The Nazis didn't just loot, they also rewrote. Stolen works were catalogued, assigned to state museums, sold at international auctions, or used to decorate the private offices of the regime's top brass. Hermann Göring, for example, had a group of agents dedicated exclusively to finding art for his personal collection. In every occupied city from Paris to Prague, his name was among the preferred recipients of looted pieces. It is estimated that by the end of the war, Göring owned more than 1,400 works, many of them confiscated directly from deported Jews. The apparatus in charge of this massive appropriation was the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, ERR, a seemingly academic cultural organization led by Alfred Rosenberg, the ideologue of Nazism. In practice, the ERR functioned as a cultural shock force, specializing in identifying, seizing, and transporting works of art of Jewish or undesirable origin. ERR personnel operated with complete impunity. They could enter galleries, homes, and museums and pack away whatever they deemed valuable. In France alone, from the Jeu de Paume Museum in Paris, the ERR shipped more than 20,000 works to Germany. Many of these objects ended up in secret depots. In Austria, the Altarpiece salt mines became one of the prime hiding places for stolen art. Deep, stable caverns housed crates of paintings by Rembrandt, Vermeer, and Bruegel, along with medieval tapestries, Gothic sculptures, and illuminated manuscripts. The destination of this treasure was the planned Führer Museum in Linz, Hitler's hometown, which was to become, in his vision, the new cultural capital of Europe. The museum was never built, but the trains kept coming. The looting was not limited to the elite. In every Jewish neighborhood, in every requisitioned home, personal belongings were appraised, labeled, and redistributed. From candlesticks to sheet music, from family portraits to carpets and crockery, everything was considered part of the German cultural heritage by right of conquest. In many cases, destruction accompanied the theft. Synagogues were looted and then burned. Sacred books were kept if they were rare, or destroyed if they were common. Family photographs were discarded or destroyed. The objective was clear: to strip Jews not only of their economic heritage, but also of their historical, symbolic, and emotional imprint. The machinery of plundering was refined over time. Blacklists of Jewish collectors and dealers were created. Officials were trained to recognize artists, techniques, and signatures. Parallel inventories were compiled to identify previously stolen works, which were then tracked down on the international market. The collaboration of some German experts and dealers was essential. Figures such as Bruno Lohse and Cajetan Mühlmann grew rich, serving as intermediaries between the regime and the art world, appraising, reselling, or exchanging pieces to museums or private collectors. As the war progressed, looting spread to other occupied countries. In Holland, thousands of works belonging to Jewish families like the Goudstickers were confiscated. In Poland, it is estimated that more than 90% of Jewish collections, public and private, were expropriated, many of them destroyed along with their owners. Even in Italy and Hungary, where local collaboration was crucial, requisitions were carried out with equal brutality. The magnitude of this theft is difficult to imagine. It is estimated that the Nazis seized between 600,000 and 1 million works of art during the conflict. Added to this are millions of books, liturgical objects, documents, photographs, and archaeological artifacts. The crime was so vast that, at the end of the war, the Allies created specialized groups like the Monuments Men tasked with tracking down, recovering, and returning stolen art. However, much of the loot was never found. Thousands of pieces remain missing, hidden in private collections, sold on grey markets, or lost in unexplored repositories. The Ahnenerbe, archaeology, mysticism, and the Third Reich's reinvented past. While the armies of the Third Reich advanced across Europe with tanks and armoured divisions, another quieter unit scoured mountains, ruins, and monasteries in search of something that could not be captured with cannons: the mythological past of the Germanic people. This organization, known as the Ahnenerbe, short for German Ancestral Heritage, Foundation for the Study of Ancient Germanic History, was created in 1935 by Heinrich Himmler with the aim of providing a scientific, archaeological, and mystical basis for National Socialist ideology. In other words, the mission was clear: to demonstrate that the Aryan race was the legitimate heir of a superior and ancient civilization, erasing from the path any evidence that contradicted it. The Ahnenerbe combined archaeology, anthropology, history, linguistics, occultism, and ethnography. But its goal was not historical truth, but the construction of a narrative that justified Aryan supremacy. Himmler firmly believed in the existence of an ancient Germanic Atlantis and believed that the Germans had given rise to all the great civilizations of the past, from the Egyptians to the Vikings, the Greeks, the Mayans, and the Buddhists. This delusional vision became state policy, and under its auspices, dozens of expeditions were launched across Europe, Asia, and Africa in search of relics, inscriptions, structures, and bones that fit this distorted vision of the past. But when the Third Reich collapsed in 1945 and the Allied armies entered Germany, what they found was not just the devastation of war. They found the material remains of that ideological enterprise. In basements, warehouses, castles, and laboratories, hundreds of objects collected by the Ahnenerbe were discovered, many of them stored alongside documents, maps, photographs, labeled skulls, and artifacts that had previously remained hidden. One of the key locations was Wewelsburg Castle in Westphalia. As American troops approached, the SS attempted to destroy the castle to erase the evidence. Although part of the structure was blown up, Allied soldiers managed to enter in time to recover numerous materials: pagan figurines, runic symbols carved in stone, ceremonial furniture, Nordic relics, swords, decorated skulls, and manuscripts copied from medieval and Vedic sources. They also found astrological charts, esoteric diagrams, and correspondence between Himmler and the expedition leaders. Elsewhere in the Reich, the discoveries were even more macabre. At the University of Strasbourg, part of Professor August Hertz's so-called Jewish skeleton collection was discovered, a pseudo-scientific project sponsored by the Ahnenerbe. 86 incomplete skeletons were recovered, along with identification tags, correspondence, photographs of the prisoners before they were murdered, and detailed records of their alleged racial origins. These remains were exhumed, analyzed, and in many cases ceremoniously reburied, while the documents were used at the Nuremberg trials. In Berlin and Munich, confiscated archives revealed the volume of materials sent by the Ahnenerbe to museums, castles, and SS headquarters. Much of this wealth was hidden in mines, churches, caves, and monasteries during the final months of the war. In the mines of Heilbronn and Siegen, the Americans found boxes containing Tibetan skulls, Buddhist ritual instruments, Sanskrit texts, copies of Icelandic books, funerary masks, and archaeological fragments of European and Asian origin, all meticulously labeled with serial numbers and anthropological records. Lappish artifacts were also discovered in the Bavarian Alps: shamanic drums, bone belts, stones with sun engravings, and samples of ritual cloth from Finnish Lapland. Some of these objects were accompanied by racial interpretation notes prepared by ethnologists from the Ahnenerbe, who attempted to link these artifacts to the ancient Aryans of the north. In Austria, as with the art looted by the Nazis, hidden containers were found in caves near Altaussee and Hallstatt that housed not only paintings and sculptures, but also boxes containing Indian bronze figurines, Tibetan amulets, human fossils, and elements of African cultures collected during minor expeditions to Tunisia and Libya. The mishmash of pieces, many out of context, was an example of the Nazis' obsessive classification drive to integrate any ancient symbol into their mythical racial narrative. The British, for their part, entered Marburg in 1945 and confiscated an important ethnographic archive with thousands of cards and photographs collected during the war by members of the Ahnenerbe. They documented expeditions to Bosnia, Norway, Italy, and Ukraine, with images of folk rituals, musical instruments, ancient weapons, and everyday objects that Nazi researchers considered vestiges of the Aryan soul dispersed throughout Europe. Despite these discoveries, many objects collected by the Ahnenerbe were never found. It is presumed that a large portion was destroyed by the retreating Germans themselves, fearing that the relics would fall into Soviet hands or serve as evidence in trials. Other objects ended up in private hands, distributed among collectors, Allied soldiers, or art dealers, and even today appear sporadically at auctions or in museum depots of uncertain provenance. The Ahnenerbe's documents, however, were fundamental to reconstructing the scope of its work. From the archives recovered in Munich, Berlin, and Marburg, a detailed map was drawn up of the expeditions, institutional contacts, collaborating universities, and the names of the scientists involved. These records showed not only the roots of archaeological looting, but also the connection between scientific research, ideology, and crime. At the Nuremberg trials, the Ahnenerbe's name was cited numerous times, especially in the doctor's trial, where its role in human experimentation was starkly exposed. Wolfram Sievers, the organization's administrative director, was found guilty and executed in 1948. Other members, such as Schaffer, escaped justice and continued their careers in obscurity or in other countries. Today, recovered Ahnenerbe artifacts are scattered across various museums and scientific institutions: the Germanic National Museum in Nuremberg, the Ethnological Museum in Berlin, the Munich Historical Museum, and the German Federal Archives. In many cases, the pieces are in storage and not on display, both due to their origin and the ethical implications of preserving them. Other objects were returned to their countries of origin, such as some Tibetan, Icelandic, and Sami artifacts, in discrete cultural restitution agreements. What was uncovered after the surrender was more than an exotic collection of bones and masks. It was tangible evidence of an ideological delirium that sought to manipulate history, symbolism, and science to justify a machine of death. The Ahnenerbe, with its display cases full of skulls and suitcases laden with stolen icons, revealed to the world how the past can be hijacked and turned into a tool of destruction. In the basements of the Reich lay not only the plundering of memory, it also echoed an ambition that sought to turn archaeology into a weapon of hatred, the weapons that would give him power. In the cellars of the Reich lay not only the plundering of memory, there also lay the echo of an ambition that sought to transform archaeology, history, and legend into weapons of total domination. This obsession crystallized in a handful of relics to which Hitler's inner circle attributed an almost thaumaturgical power. Between 1938 and 1945, the Spear of Destiny, the imperial regalia of the Holy Roman Empire, the myth of the Holy Grail, and the solar emblem that Himmler embedded in the Voilsburg were invoked to cement the authority of a regime that proclaimed itself the heir to all the Germanic empires and the repository of the Aryan historical mission. What follows narrates, with the greatest possible documentary rigor, the life cycle of these objects, how they were seized, transported, hidden, and finally rescued after the collapse of the Third Reich. The ancient Heilige Lanze, the alleged lance that the centurion Longinus plunged into the side of Christ, had been on display for centuries in the Schatzkammer of Vienna's Hofburg Palace. The young Adolf Hitler saw it there in 1912 when he was living in poverty, and was convinced that the spear had guaranteed the victories of Constantine, Charlemagne, and the German emperors. On October 13, 1938, 7 months after the Anschluss, the lance and the entire Habsburg imperial treasury were loaded onto a special train and driven under SS escort to Nuremberg. They were to preside over the lavish annual party celebrations in the sanctuary city of National Socialism. For several months, the relic was displayed in St. Catherine's Church, but Allied bombing forced it to be moved to the cellars dug beneath the castle rock, the Historischer Kunstbunker, a 24-meter deep shelter specifically designed to protect works of art. On the morning of April 30, 1945, art historian and Monuments Men officer Walter Horn entered the bunker and found the imperial lance, crown, scepter, and orb behind a false brick wall. 2 hours later, Hitler committed suicide in Berlin. The coincidence fueled the legend that the lance lost whoever dropped it. Horn kept the pieces in custody in Munich and in January 1946 returned them to Austria, where they are now on display in the Hofburg. Despite the return, the lance's authenticity has been questioned. Metallographic analysis suggests Carolingian rather than Roman manufacture. Other scholars maintain that the original point was coated in the 10th century. These debates, however, are secondary to the historical fact. The spear served Nazism as a legitimizing totem, and for Hitler, it was the talisman that sealed the continuity between his Reich and the throne of Charlemagne. The treasure recovered by Horn included the octagonal crown circa. 962 AD, 2 ceremonial swords, the Joyous of Charlemagne and the so-called Sword of St. Maurice, the cruciferous globe, and the enameled scepter that had sanctified the investiture of the Holy Roman Emperors. Hitler ordered its return to Nuremberg to merge his regime with the memory of medieval coronations. The transfer was carried out in reinforced, climate-controlled boxes and under a 24-hour custody protocol supervised by the Reich police. For propaganda purposes, it was the announcement of an imperial renaissance whose capital would be Linz, the future site of the planned Führer Museum. The collection survived the bombing of August 28 to 29, 1942. Some 500 aerial mines fell on Nuremberg, unscathed thanks to the vaulted walls of the Kunstbunker. When the Americans opened it, they found, in addition to the treasure, dozens of boxes containing Gothic tapestries, illuminated Bibles and royal porcelain that the City Council had protected there since 1940. Everything was inventoried, photographed, and transferred to Allied control before its return. While Hitler appropriated imperial symbols, Heinrich Himmler obsessively pursued the most elusive relic, the Holy Grail. He became interested in the cup through the medievalist and SS officer Otto Rahn, who, after publishing Crusade Against the Grail, 1933, convinced the Nazi leadership that the cup could be found in the Occitan castle of Montségur, the last Cathar stronghold in 1244. Rahn conducted surveys in Languedoc and Pyrenean caves, photographing capitals and runes that he intended to link to Templar traditions. In October 1940, Himmler visited the Catalan monastery of Montserrat after meeting with Franco. Accompanied by bodyguards and translators, he demanded access from Abbot Marcet to all the underground chambers and liturgical archives. Frustrated by the refusal, the monastery only allowed a formal visit, the Reichsführer left convinced that the monks were hiding the cup. The episode was recorded in François diplomatic reports and in photographs seized from the Ahnenerbe in 1945. Although he never found the Grail, Himmler amassed dozens of pre-Christian objects linked to the myth at Wewelsburg, stone chalices found in forgotten temples, Bavarian statuettes of the goddess Nerthus, Celtic sun discs, and Hallstatt cauldrons that the SS classified as prototypes of the sacred vessel. Many were found charred or looted when the castle was burned by its own defenders on March 31, 1945, in the face of the advance of the US 3rd Armored Division. Wewelsburg Castle was not chosen at random. Himmler, obsessed with Germanic symbolism and Arthurian legends, ordered a detailed study of it before turning it into the mystical heart of the Schutzstaffel. Located on a promontory in the shape of an isosceles triangle, the castle seemed to respond to a predestined design. In the eyes of Himmler and his esoteric advisors, the land itself was charged with energy and was to serve as the spiritual axis of the new order that Hitler dreamed of imposing in Europe. Its strategic location coincided, in his own words, with the energy center of the Germanic continent. The North Tower was transformed into a restricted access sanctuary. There, embedded in the stone floor, he ordered the famous 12-spoked black slate disc to be placed, a symbol that some scholars interpreted as a representation of solar cycles, others as a stylization of the Sig runes, the emblem of the SS, and still others as a deliberate recreation of the Hyperborean sun wheel. Years later, the symbol was renamed Sonnenrad, or Schwarze Sonne, the Black Sun, and became a cult iconography among neo-Nazi groups, occultists, and followers of Aryan mysticism. The castle was conceived as an Aryan Vatican, and its interior was painstakingly remodeled. Its corridors were hung with banners embroidered with Germanic motifs, ritual Viking axes, reconstructed heraldic shields, and busts of mythical figures such as Widukind and Arminius. Himmler ordered the construction of a circular underground crypt beneath the tower, with niches to house the funerary urns of the 12 most loyal Obergruppenführers. In the center of this crypt, an eternal flame was to burn on a sacred stone, surrounded by columns emulating pre-Christian Nordic architecture. But perhaps the most disturbing element was the collection of ritual objects. Thousands of Totenkopf rings returned after the deaths of SS officers, each with initials, the date of their surrender, and runes engraved on them, were lined in glass cases. Ceremonial swords forged from German steel with Gothic inscriptions, Wotan figurines, and human skulls, presumed to have been used in initiation rituals. The library also included copies of Icelandic manuscripts, medieval grimoires, and Germanic lineage studies compiled by the Ahnenerbe. When the Americans occupied Wewelsburg in April 1945, they found burned-out rooms, unexploded ordnance, and partially destroyed documents. Many original objects had been evacuated during the final months of the Reich. The remainder, some 230 pieces, were sent to the Bonn State Museum, where they were classified as pseudo-historical props, replicas of no archaeological value, and ritual curiosities. However, the whereabouts of the original urns, the returned rings, and certain texts remain unknown to this day, fueling myths, clandestine investigations, and conspiracy theories. The castle survives as a museum, but also as a sinister echo of the mystical delirium that intoxicated the Third Reich. Gurings' personal art collection. Hermann Gurings' personal art collection was one of the largest, most ambitious, and morally corrupt private accumulations of masterpieces during the 20th century. Second in command of the Third Reich, commander of the Luftwaffe and self-confessed aesthete, Göring used power, state violence, and the Nazi plundering machine to build a private gallery worthy of an emperor. What the Allies discovered after his fall was not only an extraordinary collection in terms of volume and quality, but a brutal reflection of how European art was stripped, stolen, and perverted in the name of absolute power. From the start of the regime in 1933, Göring began acquiring works, first through spontaneous donations from cornered German collectors, then through forced purchases at ridiculous prices, and finally through the outright looting of Jewish collections. With the outbreak of war, Nazi cultural policy offered him unrestricted access to the art treasures of occupied Europe. As a top leader, Göring could enter any museum, castle, or private collection and point to whatever he wanted. His name appeared at the top of the preference lists of the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, ERR, the unit charged with the systematic looting of works of art in France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Poland, and other subject countries. His residence at Karinhall, a vast estate outside Berlin named after his first wife, Karin, became a sort of private museum. With monumental architecture and neo-Baroque decor, Karinhall housed hundreds of paintings, sculptures, tapestries, ancient weapons, jewelry, porcelain, manuscripts, historic furniture, and liturgical objects. Göring had a special gallery built with controlled lighting, custom-designed glass cases, and soaring ceilings to display his treasure. The space was more than a collection. It was a theater of power, a reflection of his megalomania and his desire to rival the great collectors of history. Among the works that passed through his hands were masterpieces by Rubens, Van Dyck, Vermeer, Rembrandt, Cranach, Titian, Goya, and many other top names. He also enthusiastically acquired decorative art, French Gobelins, Renaissance silverware, Louis XV furniture, and rare objects such as astronomical clocks, antique scientific instruments, and Venetian glass. It is estimated that there were more than 1,500 pieces in his collection at the height of the war, many of them stolen directly from Jewish families such as the Rothschilds, the Wildensteins, the Schlossers, and the Gutstickers. Göring didn't just steal for the sake of accumulation. He boasted of his good taste and devoted personal time to reviewing catalogues, visiting repositories, and presiding over selections in expropriated museums. He often visited the Jeu de Paume in Paris, converted by the Nazis into a sorting center for looted art. There, seated in a special armchair, he selected paintings that he then sent in sealed trains to Germany. He even organized exchanges with collaborating collectors and dealers to replace lesser paintings with more valuable ones, as if running a private auction house for the remains of European plunder. Some of the figures who collaborated with his voracity were intermediaries such as Bruno Loos and Walter Andreas Hofer, who were responsible for tracking down works, negotiating with dealers in Switzerland, France, and the Netherlands, and arranging transport. There were also restorers, photographers, and archivists who catalogued each piece with almost scientific meticulousness. The archives found after the war included detailed inventories with technical descriptions, measurements, provenances, and locations within Carinhall. This organization only reinforced the systematic nature of the looting. Göring was not a private collector in the traditional sense, but the greatest personal beneficiary of Nazi cultural theft. In 1945, seeing the Soviet advance imminent, Göring ordered the evacuation of Carinhall. Train after train departed for secret depots in southern Germany and Austria, such as Altarpiece and Berchtesgaden, where works were hidden in salt mines and fortified tunnels. Finally, he gave the order to destroy the estate. On April 28th of that year, the Luftwaffe dynamited Carinhall to prevent it from falling intact into enemy hands. The palace disappeared, but some of its contents were saved. After the war, the Allies, especially the monuments men, recovered much of the art looted by Göring. Dozens of truckloads of crated art were found, ready to be hidden or sold. In 1945, in Berchtesgaden, entire crates of works labeled with his personal seal were seized, many with handwritten notes indicating their provenance or comments on their condition. From that moment on, a slow and complex process of restitution began, which continues to this day. Some pieces returned to their original owners or their heirs, others remain in state museums, and many remain missing, reappearing sporadically on the black market or in private collections. During the Nuremberg trials, evidence from his collection was used to show not only the regime's corruption, but also its utter contempt for European culture. Göring attempted to justify his actions with an air of aesthete, proclaiming himself the protector of German heritage. But documents, photographs, and testimonies exposed him as a compulsive thief protected by state terror. His love of art was nothing more than a refined mask for plunder. Treasures stolen from Mother Russia. During the German invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, Nazi troops acted in unison with their art, archaeology, and cultural specialists. Under direct orders from Hitler and Rosenberg, thousands of objects were systematically stolen. Orthodox icons, medieval manuscripts, imperial furniture, Meissen porcelain, and, above all, the symbols of the Tsar's power. The most emblematic case was the Amber Room at Catherine Palace. In just 36 hours, the Wehrmacht dismantled it, more than 6 tons of amber and gold leaf, packed it in 27 wooden coffins, and transported it to Königsberg, a renowned Prussian city. There it was ceremoniously reassembled as a Nazi trophy. At the same time, the so-called Königsberg Amber Treasure was formed, a diverse collection of uncut Baltic gems, Art Deco objects from museums in Pskov or Smolensk, and dozens of 18th-century canvases. This wealth was evacuated after the Allied bombings of August 1944, and its last documentary trace dates back to February 1945, when witnesses saw boxes being shipped to Bavaria or aboard the ship Karlsruhe, later sunk in the Baltic. The Romanov jewels also did not escape the looting. Tiaras, Fabergé eggs, necklaces, watches, and pieces with diamonds sewn into ceremonial uniforms taken from display cases in Pavlovsk and transported to Berlin. Part was recovered by the Allies in 1945, but another part was lost in the final confusion of the regime. Luftwaffe records show shipments to Switzerland on confidential trains, and isolated pieces continue to emerge at anonymous auctions or in private collections. When the Red Army took Königsberg in April 1945, it found catacombs, mines, and bunkers filled with Soviet art, but only a loose amber mosaic from the chamber appeared as a clue. The Romanov jewels left behind survivors, unlocated shipping lists. Theories point to various possibilities. The treasure was destroyed during Allied bombing or by Soviet artillery. Part was clandestinely sold after the war. Other pieces are hidden in vaults full of secrets, and many more sank on torpedoed ships. Today, 80 years later, Russia estimates that more than 200,000 pieces remain to be recovered. The international outcry persists, and the Amber Room has become a symbol of the unresolved political-cultural nexus. Sporadic excavations continue. Divers explore sunken vessels like the Karlsruhe, while historians scour Swiss, German, and Soviet records. What has been recovered? Reconstructions, fragments, are but a distant echo of what it represented, an open wound in Russia's heritage memory and a warning about how art can be both victim and spoils in the war machine. The Treasures of Belgium. During World War II, the cities of Bruges and Ghent, jewels of medieval and early modern Flanders, fell victim to the cultural plunder perpetrated by the Nazis. The war not only destroyed cities and lives, but also cast an indelible shadow over the region's artistic heritage. When the Germans occupied Belgium in May 1940, an organized and meticulous plundering operation began under the auspices of the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, ERR, the same criminal network that ravaged Paris, Amsterdam, and other major cultural centers. In Bruges, the main target was the Madonna of Bruges, Michelangelo's only outdoor sculpture located in the Church of Our Lady. Although the statue itself was secretly removed by the church and taken to Madrid for safekeeping during the first occupation, the local community was forced to collaborate with the Nazis by dismantling display cases, clearing churches, and collecting medieval codices. Some church relics, such as silver chalices, reliquaries, and manuscripts, were not evacuated and were instead seized by SS officers, who were then sent to depots in Paris and Berlin. The orders were clear. Any religious or historical object linked to the Flemish tradition was to be confiscated, labelled, packaged, and sent to the Reich. Ghent's St. Bavo Cathedral housed one of the world's most celebrated art treasures, the Adoration of the Mystic Lamb Altarpiece, Ghent Polyptych, a masterpiece by Jan and Hubert van Eyck. In the early decades of the war, Belgian authorities moved it to France for safekeeping. However, in 1942, the Französisches Museum in Pau, guarded by Vichy and Nazi troops, was raided by the Gestapo and agents of Heinrich Himmler, who relocated the work to Neuschwanstein and finally to Altarpiece, Austria. What makes the episode even more dramatic is that a wooden plaque, the Just Judges, had been stolen in 1934 in another unrelated theft and was never recovered. This missing piece lent the altarpiece an almost mythical aura. For Hitler and his ideologues, it was not just about taking away art, but also about objectifying heritage with a symbolic European Christian meaning. The looting was systematic and supported by bureaucratic procedures. The ERR compiled detailed lists of works of art and religious objects, which were sent in sealed trains under military escort to depots in Germany. Masterpieces were separated and sent to the Führer Museum in Linz, while other objects were distributed among Göring, Hitler, and local commanders through secret auctions or forced sales to Swiss dealers. The Madonna of Bruges received its modern name in May 1944, when the sculpture, haphazardly hidden in a Red Cross truck, was discovered by American soldiers at Altarpiece, along with Vermeer works, the Ghent Polyptych, and other Belgian treasures, hidden in underground salt mines designed by the Reich to protect them from bombing. The statue was returned to Bruges in 1945 by American and British intermediaries in an official ceremony featuring the incarnation of the Monuments Men and has been on display in the church ever since, under heightened security. The Ghent Altarpiece was found intact in Altarpiece in May 1945. Although it was incomplete, missing the piece stolen in 1934, the Just Judges, the other 11 upper and lower panels were returned in August 1945 in a historic ceremony at St. Bavo's Cathedral. However, the missing panel remains missing and has been the subject of theories ranging from being destroyed in bombing raids to being hidden in private collections to being burned by Nazi phalangist militants. At the end of the war, the Monuments, Fine Arts and Archives, MFAA, the so-called Monuments Men, and the Allied military services found vast deposits. In Altarpiece, about 6,500 works, including Belgian examples. The Bruges Madonna was located with little damage, while the altarpiece had to be dismantled, restored, transported by military convoy to Belgium, and properly reinstalled. Bruges tapestries, Gothic stained glass windows, illuminated manuscripts, and church relics from Bruges that had remained invisible to the Nazis for years were also accounted for. However, many smaller works, religious vessels, chalices, reliquaries, disappeared without a trace. Some may have been destroyed in the final bombing raids or sold clandestinely during the Nazi retreat from January to May 1945. Some pieces were seized by Allied soldiers, episodes documented by museums and military records, while valuable objects are presumed to have been sold from hiding places in Switzerland or Austria. Recent research in 2022 to 2024, supported by databases such as Looted Art World War II Belgium, has identified dozens of objects related to collections in Bruges and Ghent. Belgian authorities estimate that more than 2 million more are still missing. 1,000 smaller pieces, mostly liturgical art and some of medium value. The masterpieces have been restored and protected, but the Gothic sculpture mosaic from Bruges, ancient religious tapestries, and liturgical manuscripts remain in private collections with no clear future. The most enigmatic piece is the missing panel from The Just Judges, which has fueled archaeological expeditions and even film proposals. In September 2023, Ghent University launched a program to scan vaults, private archives, and catalogue plates belonging to European collectors, following a lead pointing to a wealthy family in Austria who, according to rumours, knew of its possession. The gold route across half of Europe. During the war, the Reichsbank turned gold plundering into an industrial operation. Between 1939 and 1945, the reserves of 15 central banks, Austria, Czechoslovakia, Belgium, the Netherlands, Poland, Greece, and the Baltic states, among others, were emptied and transferred to Berlin. There, the metal was melted down, the original seals scraped off, and the imperial eagle affixed. Once anonymized, the gold followed two major laundering routes. The busiest crossed the Chiasso Pass to Zurich. According to the Bergier Commission, 76% of the gold moved by Nazi Germany, around $450 million at the time, passed through the vaults of the Swiss National Bank or private banks such as UBS and Credit Suisse, which resold it to Portugal, Sweden, and Spain to pay for strategic raw materials. Documents declassified in 1998 showed that during the height of the war, bullion continued to enter Switzerland at a rate of several tons per month. The certificates changed hands, but the trail of the plunder remained buried behind Swiss banking secrecy. The second route, less documented but equally murky, faced the South Atlantic. Beginning in 1943, when the Allies tightened the European financial siege, Berlin began preparing an escape and financing route to South America. It brought together managers from the Dienststelle Walter Schellenberg, agents from the Odessa network, and diplomats from the Argentine embassy in Madrid. Their objective was twofold: to guarantee refuge for Nazi cadres after the defeat and to secure fresh currency for the government of Juan Domingo Perón, who was already emerging as a political arbiter in Buenos Aires. The documentary Nazi Gold in Argentina, YouTube 2004, reveals testimonies from Patagonian sailors and railway workers who saw metal crates bearing Reichsbank seals being unloaded near San Antonio Oeste and Caleta de los Loros. The shipments would have arrived on submarines, such as the U-530 and U-977, which surrendered months later in Mar del Plata. The case of these two U-boats fueled countless rumors that they were transporting Hitler, that they were carrying ingots and diamonds, that they sank part of the cargo only to recover it later. Allied interrogations found no gold on board, but they did find inconsistencies in the route and several crew members with large denomination banknotes. Historian Jorge Camarasa maintains that the crates were unloaded before the surrender and transported on southern railway trains to the deposits of the German Transatlantic Bank in Buenos Aires, an institution closely linked to German industrialists based in the country. Perón's government displayed a calculated ambiguity. On the one hand, in February 1946, it signed Decree 7231 prohibiting the entry of war criminals. On the other, it secretly authorized the issuance of provisional passports and the unlimited exchange of gold marks for pesos. At the same time, the Central Bank of the Argentine Republic began reporting an unusual influx of monetary gold. Between 1946 and 1950, its reserves increased from 280 to 380 tons, despite the negative trade balance. Peronist officials explained the phenomenon as the result of extraordinary grain exports, but customs records show that some of the metal arrived by ship from Spain and Portugal, bridge countries for the Nazi gold neutralized in Switzerland. The figure of Eva Duarte de Perón adds another layer of controversy. Several European newspapers, including the Irish Times and J Weekly, published reports from the Simon Wiesenthal Center in the 1990s, according to which Evita opened at least 2 encrypted accounts at Credit Suisse in the names of Austrian frontmen, where she allegedly deposited between $80 and $100 million from donations from the German colony and from German assets liquidated in Argentina. This theory is supported by U.S. diplomatic telegrams from 1947 that refer to long lines of military trucks unloading safe deposit boxes at the presidential residence on Austria Street. No court has been able to prove it. Switzerland, protected by its bank secrecy law until 1996, always responded that there is insufficient evidence to lift the confidentiality. Meanwhile, in Europe, gold looted from Belgium, the Netherlands, Czechoslovakia, and Greece reappeared as newly minted Swiss gold bars. Some of it was used by Argentina itself to purchase European machinery and technology. The rest remained in trusts in the name of binational companies created by former Nazi officials based in Córdoba, Misiones, and the province of Buenos Aires. Researchers from the U.S. Office of Special War Affairs, the famous Eisenstadt Report, reported in 1998 that at least 1.2 tons of gold originating in the Reichsbank had evaporated into South American accounts controlled by Swiss bankers. Why, almost 80 years later, is part of this loot still hidden? There are 4 key factors. The first is Swiss banking secrecy, enforced until 1996 and partially enforced today. Without a Swiss court order, banks do not reveal owners or historical transactions, and the 30-year statute of limitations erases many records. The second is the fragmentation of gold. Nazi ingots were melted down and reminted several times, losing their serial numbers. Once mixed with new gold, they are indistinguishable. The third is political protection. During the Cold War, both the US and Perón's Argentina benefited from intelligence networks fueled by former Nazis. Revealing the gold trail would have cleared up awkward compromises. The fourth factor is the chain of private inheritances. Many ingots ended up in family chests, jewelry stores, or safes, passed down from generation to generation without their owners knowing or wanting to know their origin. The Bergier Commission's final report estimated the looted gold entering Switzerland at $8.5 billion in today's dollars. Only half was recovered or compensated. In 2023, the U.S. Senate found that Credit Suisse maintained 99 high-risk accounts linked to Nazis based in Argentina and Chile, some of which were active until 2020. The bank denied any wrongdoing but promised to review internal files. The investigation remains open. In Argentina, the trail grows cold amid myths and truths. Naval prefecture archives show atypical entries of small German boats into Caleta de los Loros between May and August 1945. Federal police documents included in the documentary Nazi Gold in Argentina reveal that, in 1947, the Casa Rosada ordered the destruction of immigration records of 142 Germans who had arrived in 1945, and an internal memorandum from the Ministry of Finance, declassified in 2016, confirms the purchase of 17.8 tons of gold abroad between 1946 and 1948 at a price 15% below market price, paid in cash and without indicating the counterparty. Not everything went unpunished. In 1952, federal judge Guillermo McHannaford opened a case for currency smuggling against Ludwig Freud, a German-Argentine financier close to Perón. The file described several metal boxes containing gold ingots originating from the port of Vigo, but was archived for reasons of state. Decades later, the National Securities Commission tracked down certificates of deposit linked to those boxes. The securities had been endorsed in 1961 to a Swiss-Argentine holding company based in Lugano. The statute of limitations expired in 1984. When Peron fell in 1955, the so-called Liberating Revolution ordered an inventory of the Casa Rosada and the presidential residence in Olivos. Among the seized items were 756 pieces of fine jewelry and 38 unmarked gold ingots. The dictatorship sold them to finance itself, and the file disappeared in 1963. To this day, there is no official accounting of Argentina's gold reserves prior to 1951. The accounting books for that period were destroyed in a 1957 fire. The consequences of that clandestine flow are still being felt. In 2020, the Buenos Aires Shoah Museum received a 1-kilogram ingot with partial Reichsbank numbers from an anonymous donor. The piece had belonged to a textile industry businessman who inherited it from his German father-in-law. The museum donated the ingot to the Banco de la Provincia for safekeeping and launched a public campaign for other families to hand over objects with possible Nazi origins. The puzzle is still incomplete. Professional divers continue searching for the wreck of the Karlsruhe freighter in the Baltic, as it may house part of the Polish reserves. Argentine historians are combing through railway archives in Patagonia, and the Swiss government, under pressure from Jewish NGOs, has digitized 70,000 inactive account records from the 1940s and 1950s. Each new piece confirms that Nazi gold, melted down, renamed and distributed, was more than just loot. It became the raw material for political alliances, escape networks, and fortunes that still resist the light of history. While the metal slumbers behind armored doors, its memory continues to demand justice and transparency.